You're listening to Inside the War Room, Case Studies in Crisis. Join us as we explore true stories and reveal new insights with our guests, key figures in some of the largest and most complex events of our time. In this episode,
in the course of 2 weeks, probably like many people experienced in March, those 5 projects that represented a combined total probably of altogether like 30 to 40 years of work literally got shut down, and they all went away. So that physical, emotional, financial whiplash was devastating. It was the busiest I'd ever been in my entire career, and it was going to be the largest financial year that I ever had in my entire career. It went from that to $0 and nothing happening in the course of 2 weeks.
And now, it's time to go inside the war room with your hosts, Shireen Abadi, Michael Estevez, and Jordan Strauss.
The coronavirus disrupted every industry, and especially film and television production. Today, Shireen talks with Todd Lieberman of Mandeville Films. Todd is a producer of the award-winning movies Wonder, Beauty and the Beast, The Proposal, and, of course, Beverly Hills Chihuahua. What did Hollywood go through in the last 12 months? And how do you keep a business running during an industry-redefining crisis? Well, today we hear how one producer managed to keep the cameras rolling.
Hello, listeners. Today I have the great pleasure of interviewing my friend, Todd Lieberman, who also happens to be a big-time Hollywood producer. He's the co-founder of Mandeville Films and the producer of some of our generation's most incredible films. Just to name a few, Beauty and the Beast, The Fighter, Wonder, Stronger, and one of my favorites, The Proposal. A tip for our listeners, if you're going to watch one of Todd's films, maybe don't do it in a public place like an airplane, where you laugh and or cry or both out loud and people stare at you like you're crazy. Maybe do it in the privacy of your own home where you have, a box of tissues nearby. Just saying. Todd, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to talk to you about some of your experiences as a producer and the industry of Hollywood, which is something mystical to the rest of us. We'd love to hear a little bit about who you are, how you became a Hollywood producer, maybe some of your biggest achievements, and most importantly, your favorite film. I gotta know that one.
Oh, that's such a tough question. Well, first of all, Shireen, thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it. And thanks for the really kind introduction. I both am sorry to have made you cry on a plane, and I'm also happy at the same time, because that's the idea. Is laughing and crying at the same time, having those two things together. Those are the kinds of movies I love. So, a brief introduction telling me about myself. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and spent an extraordinary amount of time as a young boy in the theater. Writing, directing, acting, producing, even though I didn't know what producing was. Turns out later I would learn. And I did that all through college too. So the theater was kind of a way for expression of emotion and stories and kind of that direct interaction with an audience where you could be on a stage and doing something and literally see it firsthand, how you're affecting somebody. And I would be the class clown guy and always loved kind of telling stories. So I moved out to LA with the idea of, well, if you want to be in entertainment, movies, television, LA's the place to do it. So I moved out here with $500 and a 1986 Toyota Camry, and figured I'd start meeting some people. A friend of mine had a friend who was working at a company that was looking for an assistant. And for anyone who's anything about Hollywood, maybe the first thing you kind of hear is, well, if you want to start in Hollywood, you got to start at the bottom. What does that mean? Is that the mailroom? Is that an assistant? Well, I became an assistant. So getting people coffee and answering phones. I was assisting 3 different people at the same time. And I would sleep at the office. This was a company called Summit Entertainment. Years later, Summit would end up releasing movies like Twilight and then becoming part of a company called Lionsgate that did Hunger Games. So I was there, and I was in the middle of like looking at deals and watching movies and reading scripts, and I was like, this is what I'm meant to do. Clearly, I'm a terrible actor. I don't have the patience or the skill set to be a writer. Directing's not really my thing, but reading scripts and kind of picking stories, that's really fun. So while I was at Summit, I was fortunate enough to be there at a moment in time where a few different things came across my desk. I started as an assistant, got promoted 4 months later, ended up being, got promoted to a director of development and vice president. And over the course of that time, there were movies that were coming at us, and several of them ended up becoming movies that made people some money. One was a movie called American Pie that I helped acquire the foreign rights to. One was a movie called Memento. But what I realized is the very first thing a producer needs to do is identify a piece of material at the very beginning that they love, right? So I can't guess on anyone else's taste. I can only understand my own. And it turns out that my taste happens to match, in many instances, the taste of wider audiences. I give some of that credit to growing up in the Midwest, by the way. So after the American Pie deal, which was kind of a highly publicized deal, made a lot of money, a bunch of people came looking out or requesting a meeting with me, and basically saying, so you clearly have some sort of an eye for finding material and getting it out to the marketplace, and it seems like people like the stuff you pick. Would you rather be involved from the ground up and actually be one that's shepherding from the very beginning the creative process? I said, well, that sounds awesome. Kind of like a lot what I did in theater. And they said, well, that's what a producer is. I said, I think I probably should be a producer then. That was over 20 years ago. So with my current business partner, David Hoberman, we've been doing it together for 21 years. You have to love it because it's a ton of no's. It's pushing a massive boulder up a hill. You're always kind of fighting and struggling to get the story told. And that really is the job. Really hard question to answer what my favorite project is. Very difficult. Because there's so many that were really important to me in various phases and degrees and differences.
It's so fascinating to hear your story. I mean, I think you hear like I moved to Hollywood for $500 and a piece of crap car. You hear that story, right? And I did some odd jobs and I waited tables, and for you sprayed cologne at people at a mall, which
even when they didn't want it, to just sprayed it on them. I'm like, you're going to buy this cologne.
I literally cannot picture you doing that. It's hilarious. But my favorite part of your story is that you were an assistant for 4 months, and then literally you jumped to like director of something and vice president, and suddenly people are making you a producer. Like, it's fantastic. I'm sure it didn't happen that easy, and I'm sure people listening are like, I could be a producer. But my favorite thing about the way you describe what a producer does, I mean, and knowing you, I know this is true, is you make movies that mean something to you. They mean something, and that doesn't mean they have to be heavy and weighty. I mean, if you think of The Proposal, it's hilarious. If you think of the Muppets, I mean, it's literally Muppets, right? So it doesn't have to be this like heavy, weighty topic, but it has to mean something. You have to be passionate about it. And I think that knowing you, I know that to be a true quality that you have.
At the end of the day, my litmus test is always, if this movie makes $0 and nobody sees it, will I still be proud that I made it? And I can say, for the most part, the answer is always yes.
Have you ever made $0?
Yes.
There you go.
Yes, I have.
We won't talk about
Welcome
those.
to 2020.
Well, that is a great segue. I mean, the podcast is called Inside the War Room, and the whole purpose of our podcast is to talk to people who have been at the helm during big storms, right? And so many of our guests, we talk about crises in the past. You're our first guest to talk about the crisis we're currently living through. And everybody, it's funny, I've heard the statement that, we're all in the same boat. Through this, we have a very shared experience across the globe, and especially across the country. And then I heard someone sort of qualify that statement that, some of us are in yachts and some are in rowboats and some are just swimming, holding on to a piece of whatever they found in the ocean, but we're all in the same storm. Right? And I think that that's pretty true. Some of us are weathering it in nicer conditions than others. But I was fascinated to think about how COVID has impacted the film industry. And in your story, having talked to you, I think is one that's going to be really interesting for our listeners. So I would love to just sort of take you back a handful of months.
Happy to talk about it. By the way, there are several friends of mine that I've spoken to when I'm bemoaning kind of the 2020 whiplash that I've experienced. They're like, well, my online business has tripled its revenue. So for the film business and for me, heading into 2020, I'm very goal-oriented, right? And the goal in the film business is get that green light. You spend years and years and years working towards someone eventually saying, yes, I will give you $50 million to tell that story. And that's the goal. So heading into 2020, my company, we had worked on, we at any given moment, we probably have about 30 to 35 projects in active development. That means scripts that are being worked on, projects that we're working with writers on, and on the film side. And on the TV side, we probably have about 10 or so at any given moment. So getting one movie greenlit is a monumental task. It is really the stars aligning in the truest sense of the word, to get so many people to agree that this story is going to be told with the right people under the right circumstances, with the budget that's allowed, marketing. It's crazy that anything actually gets made. We had 5 projects heading into 2020 that were all greenlit, 3 movies and 2 TV series that we'd been working on for years and years and years. And in the course of 2 weeks, probably like many people experienced in March, those 5 projects that represented a combined total probably of altogether like 30 to 40 years of work literally got shut down. And they all went away. So that physical, emotional, financial whiplash was devastating. It was the busiest I'd ever been in my entire career, and it was going to be the largest financial year that I ever had in my entire career. It went from that to $0 and nothing happening in the course of 2 weeks. It was really challenging. And I didn't even realize, frankly, how emotionally draining and challenging that was until probably 2 months afterwards, because you go into, crisis mode and you're dealing with people. Each one of these projects has, 250 or so people working on them. So they all have their livelihoods that are being disrupted. So you got to deal with that. First and foremost, keeping people safe. Coming up with strategies of, we're shutting down now, but in the future, here's our plan. And no one knew anything. Like we didn't know how or what or anything. And you have to, be vulnerable and understanding, while at the same time not necessarily representing the panic that you're feeling yourself. And it was grave.
I'm imagining that given your industry and given how difficult it is to actually make a movie and how many sort of moving parts there are. I mean, even think of an actual startup, right? The rate of success for startups, I don't know what it is, but I imagine it's small. And I imagine they encounter all sorts of delays and difficulties and all sorts of unexpected outside forces impacting their abilities to succeed. Is it the same for the film industry?
Absolutely. There's so many variables to success, failure, and we like to think we're in control of that. And I think to a certain degree, right, you have to put all the best efforts into something. The idea has to be great. The script has to be great. You have to assemble a great team. But then the term that we use in the movie business is then it's up to the movie gods, right? So there's so many things that could happen. Is it the right day for that movie to be released? What's the state of the country? Is there weather? Was the marketing exactly right, targeted to the right people? Was there something else that was coming out on that exact weekend that took away from your business that you couldn't have known became the sleeper hit?
You have told me before about some of these unexpected delays you've experienced. I think one of them is when you talked about you were filming maybe on location in Mexico and there was something about a kidnapping. And then you talked about...
That was a
filming.
Secret.
Sorry. We can delete that part. We'll edit it out.
I'm kidding.
Can you tell us briefly one of your most interesting stories that's in the past that you've now overcome?
Well, yeah, there's so many of them. You'd mentioned a kidnapping. I can't actually talk about that story because it's crazy. We're making a movie called Beverly Hills Chihuahua, and we were shooting in Mexico with live animals, and one of our dogs was kidnapped for ransom.
That's not real.
That is real.
You're just making this up at this point.
No, that is 100% real. Anytime you go on location to any place, you have a local team there that essentially becomes the eyes and ears and you're in to the area. So we worked with that local team who worked with the government and everything worked out fine.
Not to take you back, but did you guys end up paying the ransom for the dog?
I cannot say. This is like
Some
the
things
FBI.
will
This is the
remain
FBI
secret.
person in you coming out right now. I will not say. There were so many, Shireen, so many stories that happened on the filming of that movie for such a sweet movie called Beverly Hills Chihuahua. The amount of insanity that went on was almost not to be believed.
So needless to say, you are accustomed to dealing with delays and sort of unexpected mishaps and things like that. But I think COVID has shown us that despite how resilient we might be or accustomed to change or adaptable we are, that this is a whole nother beast. Like this has impacted people in a way that is maybe unprecedented is a good word. And I'm really curious from your perspective, because I think you deal with more unexpectedness in your day-to-day life and more delays and more sort of what we would consider crises. You know, I remember you telling me a story actually, sort of the day you had to start shutting things down. And I'm really curious about that. So do you remember like where you were, what happened, and what was going through your mind at that time?
Every one of these projects, as I mentioned, had an office and they were up and running and people were at these offices across the world doing what we call prep. You know, before a movie actually shoots, you're prepping, you're kind of figuring out locations, you're casting, you're working on the script, you're hiring other people and lighting department, and you're just kind of building the team and everything's moving toward, you're creating the master blueprint of what the movie will be so that once the cameras start rolling, everyone's got a really clear idea. So we were in prep on all of these. And I was on my way to a casting session in Los Angeles. And I got an urgent call from the head of a particular studio. And this person said to me, I've got bad news. We're going to shut the movie down. And I said, I understand. And so that was basically the decision that, we don't see this getting better. And so we feel like, A, for the safety of everybody in the crew, and B, for our financial investment, it would be prudent for us to shut it down. And that was the beginning of the dominoes. And then everybody followed suit. So I went into gear and started making those calls, sick to my stomach, because it not only forecasted for me that, my business, my personal business, as well as my business overall, was going to go through a massive, massive upheaval. I knew that every single person that I called and every single person that those people had to call, which, over the course of those projects was, 1,000 people or something, it was going to impact each one of them individually. So I don't like thinking back to that moment, because it was really, really stressful. I can't compare my situation to millions and millions of other people who are going through, like you said, the same storm. But I've been lucky to have many years of success and many years of things I'm proud of. But I know that there's people that are starting in the business, or people that maybe were getting their first shot at something, and the rug's being pulled out from them. So that was hurt. It was hurting me both personally, but also putting myself into so many different people's shoes. And that began the process of essentially, I would say, 2 months. 2 months of calling people, trying to figure out protocols. What does this mean? Giving people the truth, but also keeping the hope alive that we'll figure it out somehow. Even when I didn't believe it myself. And there were absolutely many moments where I was despondent, but I had to force myself to be truthful and at the same time hopeful, and not be a black cloud that I was feeling desperately inside my own body. Months later, 2 of those projects have reemerged, and 2 additional projects that weren't even in the conversation back then have now been greenlit.
That's really interesting. Basically, you kind of defined crisis leadership in what you just said. Understanding that you need to give truth, but also provide hope. And that dark cloud that you mentioned, that you're living inside of, sort of suppressing that for the sake of the people that are dependent on you. It was really beautiful the way you described that. Clearly, you create images for people because you created one in my head that was just really vibrant and helped me understand exactly what you were going through. I want to sort of direct you to one film in particular. You mentioned being from Ohio, and I believe you still have family that lives there, and you have been, for many years that I've known you, trying to make a film there. And that was one of the ones, I believe, that was greenlit at the beginning of this year, and one of the ones that was unfortunately derailed as a result of COVID. And I'm wondering if you can kind of tell us, given that one was of more personal importance, I would imagine, than some of the others, can you just talk to us a little bit about what it was like to make that decision to shut that down?
Sure. When I first moved to LA in 1995, I remember standing on the front porch of my house that I grew up in. My mom giving me a hug before I got in that Camry. And she said a couple things to me. One was, don't lose the morals and the values that we brought you up with. The second one was, promise me you'll film a movie in Cleveland. And the third one was, you have to introduce me to Barbra Streisand one day. So I feel like, at least my own assessment of myself, I feel like I've managed to keep a promise on the first one. Morality, integrity, character are very important to me, especially in a business that can potentially sway off course quite a bit. And the second one, film and movie in Cleveland, I had spent years trying to get that done. And then a year later, there's a movie that I've been developing for years that is about Cleveland and about rock and roll and a band. And it got greenlit. And we were filming in Cleveland. I had exercised tons of contacts to get the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to allow us to film there. I'd gotten the Cleveland Cavaliers to allow us to film there in their stadium. We were hiring local crew. I was keeping my promise to my mom. And that was one of the movies that got shut down.
It's interesting. You have said to me that when this first happened, your sort of thought process was worst case scenario, you're going to be able to resume at least some of these fall of 2020, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, it was. There was massive speculation, right? You could, any person you talked to had a different opinion, and they were all experts. Oh, we'll be back by June. August at the latest. These were conversations. Any single person you talked to, they all had an opinion based on nothing. But in my mind, just, worst case scenario to me, worst case scenario was that we'd be shut down through the summer, and that starting in September, we'd be back up and running. Each of these budgets has now a new line item, which is COVID costs. And COVID costs are A, necessary, and B, extremely expensive. So any project that you have, the running tally right now is at about 15 to 20% on top of the budget for COVID costs. And there's many, many ways that we're dealing with it. In some instances, there are films, and one of them is going to be ours, where we treat it like the NBA, where it's literally a sealed bubble where no one goes in or out. And for the time you're making the movie, you're there. And then there's other ways that people are dealing with it, which we'll probably do in some other productions, where there's different pods of people that only work together and they never interact. So if one particular person gets a positive test, the whole pod goes down for 2 weeks and a replacement pod comes in. But those are two examples of ways that the film and TV business has adapted, but it's very expensive.
I mean, that's something I think that's still totally evolving. Like one of the things you mentioned was that, early on you're listening to these experts in the field who are opining on how long this will last and what the impact will be and where we'll be in X number of months. And I imagine for your industry, just like most, you can't just make a film. I mean, you've explained all of this work that goes into them. Some of them you've said even 10 years, right? So it's not like, oh, the world opened back up, now we can just resume filming. I imagine there's quite a bit of preparation and lead time that needs to go into starting the actual film process. So I'm really curious how you're making decisions. And maybe now it's a little bit different than it was in March, right? Because we're a little bit further into the process. But how are you making decisions when really nobody can really agree on where we even stand right now, let alone where we're going to be in January?
It's tough. So our first and foremost, like the most important thing, I'll say, to us in our company and to me as a producer, is that the people who work with us feel safe, and that we're as transparent as possible about every precautionary measure we're taking, and that they have buy-in into that experience. Nobody can promise a 0% chance that someone might get COVID. No, I mean, no one can promise that.
Given the experience that you've now had, have you built in your sort of contingencies for what if, what if the day before filming, the city I'm in reshuts down? What if someone on the set contracts COVID? These what ifs, right? Have you sort of started to build these into your normal processes?
Yeah, to a certain extent, yes. I think there's so many potential variables that it's almost impossible. You could kind of tie yourself into circles of, well, why are we even doing this? And then look, if something happens that is well beyond our control, there are absolutely going to be contingency plans. But I can also say there's probably things that we can't protect for, and things that are maybe even unforeseen.
You talked a little bit about the cost of operating in a COVID era and maybe even a post-COVID era, like the actual line item budget cost being somewhere around 20%, say. How does that factor in? I mean, do they have that much room in their budget? Is this something where you have to get the studios to give more? Or are you doing more with less? How are you making up for that gap?
It's challenging because so not only are there additional costs associated with COVID, but the appetite for financial exposure from the studios for lots of reasons. COVID being one of them, but also the changing landscape and kind of filmed entertainment is another big one, has gone down. So additional costs, less of a financial risk appetite, but we want to make the very best product and we expect the very best product. And one of the projects that we had pre-COVID that was meant to go, that we have now reinvigorated, that's going again. I won't give exact numbers, but I'll say, let me just do the quick math in my head. We had to cut 30% of the budget, and inclusive of additional COVID costs. So say 35% we had to cut. But maintain the same integrity level of the film. So those become what we like to call creative solutions to expensive problems. So you had mentioned a movie called The Proposal at the beginning of this. We made that movie, I think, 12 years ago. And there's one scene in the movie where Sandra Bullock's character and Ryan Reynolds' character are in a boat, and Sandy falls off the boat. Ryan rescues her, pulls her back into the boat. She's shivering. He puts, a sweater around her. They hug, and it's intimate. In the script, that exact feeling was represented in a very different way. There was an ice cave where Sandy's character and Ryan's character go into an ice cave, and ice falls on top of her, and she gets covered in ice, and he has to rescue her out of this ice cave before the whole thing collapses. So that sequence might sound insane right now, because those of you who have seen the movie, they're like, that doesn't make any sense. The boat scene's great. But we all loved that sequence, and I particularly loved that sequence because I thought it had both action and romance and adventure. But it cost $1 million to build that ice cave.
What?
Where the boat doesn't cost anything. It's a boat. You get him on a boat, he falls off, pulls him in, there it is. So I was convinced by other people that is not good money to spend, that let's figure out a way to get that same feeling that we had in the ice cave, but do it for a much more reasonable cost. And that's where we came up with the idea of the boat. So we're basically extrapolating that idea on all scripts, all projects across the board, and continually doing it to say, how do we do this so we're maximizing the emotional impact and effect, but we're not losing anything from doing it in a less expensive way?
You told me once before that one of the projects you were making during COVID that sort of got shut down was restarted, but you had to reduce budget. Similar to what you were saying, the studio's appetite for spending as much was not there. And you made a statement that it actually made the film better, and I'm really curious about that. I love the story about the proposal. I totally get the point. I mean, being able to create that same feeling in a creative way without spending $1 million on an ice cave, which I'm not sure why you need to do in Alaska. It seems like there's lots of ice caves there for free. But
Oh, we shot the movie in Boston.
that's part of your expensiveness.
That's why, Shireen.
And so do you think that these decisions, the forcing you to be creative in this way, actually makes movies better?
In a lot of ways I do, and I hate admitting that. But putting stress testing the creative aspect against the budgetary aspect is a good exercise. It's uncomfortable. It's a complete and utter pain in the rear, but a lot of times, and I would go so far as to say many times, the end result is something better than what you had at the beginning.
I want to talk a little bit about what happens next. You've mentioned a few times that not only are two of the projects that you thought were maybe dead in the water reviving, but you have two completely new ones that weren't even conceived of when this all began. And I'm curious, not knowing that much about the film industry, to revive a project, I mean, how easy is that? Or all the cast is just sort of waiting? Your locations are still exactly the way they were? I mean, how does that work functionally to restart something that had been shut down?
So in my dream world, it was, well, COVID's happening to everybody. So wouldn't that be nice if at the end of this, people just kind of all agreed that, well, those 6 months were lost, and now we're just kind of moving time forward and restarting where we were before, and pretend those 6 months never happened. Well, that's idealistic, and probably not realistic. Not great for business in certain circumstances. So that didn't happen. And a lot of these actors who were under television contracts, the TV show said, no, you're ours. So that then precludes them from being able to be in our film. We have to recast. And then that recasting process is massive. Figuring out someone who has the value that the studio likes, that the marketing department likes, that we like creatively, that the director likes, all those people have to align. So that's just one little example of, part of the disruption and pivoting, which, by the way, happened before COVID ever took place. Yeah, I've been through projects where you have to recast, but not to the degree that it's happening now and across the board. Again, I bet if I looked back at that moment and said, in March, in the state of mind that I was in, if I knew all the different things that I had to get all these things back up and running, all the plates I was spinning and all the juggling I was doing and the mental gymnastics and the emotional gymnastics, would I be able to do it again? I bet my answer would be absolutely not. Because from a technical place, I have to look at each day individually and say, all right, what do I do today to get that thing going today? I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow or a week from now, let alone a month from now. So today's order of business is XYZ. How do I accomplish those things? So it's that kind of one step at a time mentality that I think is the only thing that allows me to move forward without being inert or analysis paralysis kind of thing where well, what if this happens? What if this happens? And then you don't do anything. So it's that day by day thing. And each day presents its own challenge. But each day I'm doing my very best to kind of move things a little bit forward so that by the time we're ready to go, everything's been taken care of.
It's interesting. I know from speaking to you before, you've described making a film a little bit like camp. Like it's fun, everybody's together, do everything together, you hang out after filming together, you have a lot of fun, you get very close. And now some of the things you've described as protocols are, for example, everyone's going to be in pods and they only interact with their pod. People are probably going to be wearing masks and gloves and not interacting in between when they're actually filming. Maybe they'll come on separate days. And you've talked a little bit about some of these things being maybe more efficient, that, people aren't joking around and late to set and, getting, maybe having a few too many drinks and not waking up on time for their filming the next day. All of those things can be a positive. But when I think about Hollywood and I think about the film industry and TV and movies, I think of it as inherently fun, entertaining, social. I mean, even the drama, even the tragedies, even the horror films, right? I think of it as something that is meant to entertain. It's meant to incite emotion. It's meant to convey emotion. You're supposed to believe what's happening on their side. And I can't help but wonder if sort of the efficiency and the staleness of how COVID is going to change how filming happens is going to translate into the actual film and what we feel.
Look, we're obviously we're social creatures, right? Watching sports on TV, I'm trying to get myself into the headspace of like, I feel like there's a crowd there, even though I know there's not a crowd there, but the crowd helps. And my philosophy on all films that we do is I want people to have a blast. I think that people do their best work when they're having fun and they're buying into the whole thing and they're just having a good time. And so, yeah, part of it for me over the course of 21 years has been, it's a social experience. We're working hard, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. We're arguing, but we're having a good time doing it. And people are smiling and laughing. That's been my go-to. That's my move. Like, that's what I want people to have a good time. So I don't know the answer of how it's going to be on these sets with people in masks, and I won't be jumping up and down and telling jokes because no one will be able to see what I'm saying. How people interact with each other, I think it's going to be different. I think it's going to be definitely different. How it affects the work, and that slight intangible thing of what gets translated to the screen when people are genuinely having fun. I think there's a percentage of that does get translated to the screen. Does that get lost here? I don't know. But I think I'm coming up with ideas right now of how to engender community and do those kinds of things on set. I don't know yet because I haven't done it. I don't know how people are going to feel. But my goal still is that even though it will be more efficient, and even though people won't have the way of communicating that they did before, my goal still is to have a fun experience. I don't exactly know how I'm going to accomplish it, but I'm confident that I'll be able to figure out a way to do it.
So we're coming to the close of our podcast, and one of the main reasons we wanted to have you and other leaders on is to impart wisdom. It struck me that you thought of what it would be like for someone who was just now coming into the industry. Let's say they were on the verge of making their very first film. They had just been green-lighted and everything got shot down. They probably don't have the same ability to rise from the ashes as someone who has as much experience and success as you do under your belt. And so I would love to hear from you what your sort of key learnings are and what advice you might have for others, whether they're in the film industry or in other types of businesses, on how you can take this experience, this leading through a crisis, and really emerge stronger and better because of it.
I think people need to figure out what is the thing or the multiple things that drive them. If you could objectively look and say, have I been successful over the course of my life? And that success can be determined can be defined by all kinds of things. But did I get through this thing in grade school? Was I able to overcome this thing in high school? Did I do X, Y, Z in the workforce? Did I get the promotion? Anything that you've done in the past, I believe you can look to the past to determine the future. Anything that comes at you, it's a moment in time, you'll get through it, and you'll emerge from it, so long as you're in tune and making decisions based on the things that you truly and genuinely believe in.
What a great interview with Todd Lieberman. In his conversation with Shireen, there are many lessons for business leaders on how to communicate effectively in a crisis. And one of the best examples is when he rallied his team at the outset of the pandemic. A key takeaway from that situation is honesty plus optimism equals leadership. When you're in a position of authority in a crisis, people are looking to you for signals about whether you're going to make it through that situation okay. And whether you're speaking to employees, customers, or members of the community, it's important to remember the role of communication is more than just to convey information. It's to set a strategic direction for how you're going to navigate through the crisis. If you're dishonest or misleading, people are going to sense it and lose trust. But if you're solely painting a picture of despair, people are going to lose hope. But if you express honesty and optimism that together you'll find a way through the situation, people will come together. And with hard work and a little luck, you'll make it through the crisis as a stronger, more close-knit organization.
Those are great points, Michael. You know, when I work with clients that are going through really serious crises, where I feel like they can get jammed up is in two spaces. They have to make informed decisions, right? So they can make mistakes developing and processing the information, and they can make bad decisions. Usually we're brought in to help inform. It's their job to decide. But, you know, sometimes it's to help them decide too. One of the things that was really striking to me about Todd is the speed with which he gathered the information that was available, which was, you know, there was very little of it, realized that things were changing very quickly and very radically, and owned it, you know, accepted the new reality and pivoted quickly. Where I've seen crises really cartwheel is when people, be they individuals or organizations or whoever, when they can't accept the facts that are in front of them, or they can't accept that things have changed quickly and you need to respond to, you know, the world as it is today and tomorrow, not the world as it was yesterday. And I feel like owning that change, owning what you don't know and understanding what you don't know, it's a pretty key part of successful crisis management.
Those are great points. I completely agree, Jordan. Well, we want to express our thanks again to Todd for taking the time to share his views and insights with us. And that is all for this episode. We will see you next time inside the War Room.
You've been listening to Inside the War Room, Case Studies in Crisis. Inside the War Room is produced by global communications firm BCW and global investigations firm Kroll, a division of Duff & Phelps. For more information about this episode, and to learn more about how you can work with BCW and Kroll to prepare, respond, and recover from a crisis affecting your organization, visit our website at itwrpodcast.com.